Welcome to another edition of the Global Migration Lecture, which is jointly organized by the Center for Global Cooperation Research and the Interdisciplinary Center for Integration and Migration Research, both located at the University of Duisburg-Essen. My name is Volker Heinz, and I have to say right at the beginning that I've been really looking forward to this event tonight. And I'm excited to welcome our speaker, Hanna Pohl, who will give a talk entitled Borders and Money, the Moral Economy of Coming to Europe. And I'm also really happy that we could enlist Dr. Nader Talebi, who will be the discussant for Hanna's paper. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Nader is a researcher at the Berlin Institute for Integration and Migration Research and a lecturer at Humboldt University. In the past, just to mention two things I found striking, he was a coordinator of Refugees Hub, an internet platform for Farsi or Dari speakers, speaking refugees in Berlin. And a postdoctoral researcher at Transmit, Transnational Perspectives on Migration and Integration. And currently he's coordinator of the Migration in the Middle East Network. The acronym is MERGE, something we should keep in mind, I guess. Hanna, just a few words. So she's a postdoctoral researcher at the Max Planck Institute for the Studies of Societies in Cologne. For her dissertation, which she's currently turning into a book manuscript, Hanna did research on how social relations facilitate economic interactions among what is often called irregular migrants, their families, people smugglers, and various other actors on the route from Afghanistan via Iran, Turkey, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Greece to Germany. So what she did is she literally traveled with these migrants, with Afghan migrants mostly, from Iran, where she also learned Farsi, to Germany through various stages, doing field work, making interviews, also making friends, I guess, along the way for 1.5 years altogether. And she was awarded a Charlemagne Prize Academy Fellowship in 2020-21. She was a visiting researcher at the Center on Migration, Policy and Society, COMPASS, at Oxford University. And before that, a visiting PhD candidate, both at the Social Science Research Center in Berlin and at Columbia University in New York City. So I no longer want to keep you in suspense. And here's how we proceed. So Hanna will have about 30 minutes, maybe a little more if you want. Then Nader will offer his comment or first questions. And then we hope to have enough time for questions from the broader audience. And I suggest the following. You put your questions or comments in the chat, okay? And so that I can have an overview, and I will basically read them out so that Hanna or Nader can answer them. So that's it from my side. Hanna, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to letting me present here at the 5th Global Migration Lecture. I first want to acknowledge those who allowed me to follow their routes and invited me to stay with them. Today, here I am speaking as a sociologist from the country where most people that I interviewed, that I followed, wanted to go, as I'm a German passport holder. In this lecture, with the title Money and Borders, the Moral Economy of Coming to Europe, I will speak about the social relationships and economic interactions in undocumented migration trajectories. The premises of my argument are that first, to seek asylum in the EU, people have to cross territorial borders. Second, borders are never fully closed, but only become deadlier and costlier. And third, that to cross these borders, people require social relationships and money, and through this exert agency. This lecture will be divided into 3 parts. I will first speak about the research field of migration trajectories, then talk about a sociology of money and borders, and then third, we'll give an example of these monetary interactions of border crossings. And my main focus will be on people from Afghanistan who self-identify as Hazara, but who have mainly lived in Iran. But I think parts of the research can actually be transferred to other groups as well. And with this, let me share my screen with you. Yes. And I'm very much looking forward to now start into first the presentation and then the interaction and talk with you all. So the research field of migration trajectories. Migration studies for a long time has focused either on the country of origin and reasons why people leave a place, the entire debate on push and pull factors, or it has focused on the so-called country of destination and, for example, factors of integration. However, the actual trajectory, the period spanning between these 2 places, the trajectory has often been sidelined. And in recent times, this has changed, and we see more and more multi-sided research that is applied on these prolonged migration trajectories that particularly exist if people have to migrate undocumented and therefore cannot just take a plane from A to B, but are maybe on their way for several months or years. And research that actually acknowledges this entire trajectory is still very rare. An example of this would be Khosravi or Monsuti, for example. The second part of the research are Afghan migration trajectories. And Afghan migration is something that has always existed, or migration on the territory that is now called Afghanistan. However, in the 1980s, with the Soviet invasion, about 6 million people had to first be internally displaced and then flee to Iran and Pakistan. In 2021, UNHCR officially said that there are 2.7 million Afghan refugees, making them the 3rd largest group. However, the events in August, when Afghanistan, or power in Afghanistan, was handed over to the Taliban, has once again changed the process. And at the moment, there are no figures and data of how many people are displaced exactly in Afghanistan or have left the country already. From this, I want to now go into my research, which actually started before, already in 2015, so over 6 years now. And looking and understanding these migration trajectories from Afghanistan all the way to Europe meant that I had to participate or interact, work with people who did not want to be seen, who we are speaking in research about a hidden, hard to reach or marginalized population. And in my research, I had 2 different research methods. One was ethnography, and here a multi-sided ethnography, as Marcuse has already illustrated in the early 1990s, as well as the aspect of a relational ethnography laid out by Matthew Desmond. Together with this ethnography, I conducted interviews and recorded interviews with 66 people, all in Farsi or Dari. But I also wrote down conversations with more than 350 people approximately. And here it's maybe also important to say that these interviews sometimes only took place after I had known people for a very long time already. I just want to show you this map to kind of illustrate this trajectory a bit better. So while in 2014-15, I was a guest student at the University of Tehran, Danishgah Tehran, I met many Afghans who were planning to leave towards Western Europe. And in the summer of 2015, I started volunteering as a Farsi translator on the Greek islands. It was only when I started this research that eventually was my dissertation, my PhD, that I first interviewed people who had already reached Germany in the summer of 2018, and then went back to Iran as the country of origin to there talk to people who either had family members who had left them or were themselves aspiring to leave and planning to leave. When I then went to Turkey, there comes this kind of serendipity that exists in ethnographic research because by pure chance, a very close friend, someone I had known before, had decided to leave Iran. And she was by then already in Turkey and introduced me to her group of fellow migrants with whom she was smuggled together. She also introduced me to those who facilitated her routes. And this group of approximately 25 people were then smuggled into Greece, where I met them once again. And as they arrived on the island of Lesbos in Camp Moria, I had the chance to stay with them for the next 4 months that they were in Greece before they continued their way, and I continued with them along the so-called Balkan route all the way to Germany, where most of them are right now. As you can see, most of the data collection really took place between 2018 and officially 2020. However, I'm still in touch with most of them. So this is something we could also take into the Q&A, but that is not part of this book. So after this first part, where I just lay out this research on migration trajectory and the case study, I want to speak now about the sociology of money and borders. And what is behind this is, first of all, understanding economic interactions in undocumented migration research. And the main idea behind this is that asylum can only be sought once people have entered EU territory. But before this, people actually have to be mobile to reach the EU. And for these undocumented border crossings, they require money. To access these financial resources, economic interactions exist that nevertheless require, create, or shape social relationships, which then are part of the entire process of facilitating undocumented mobility. So what I did was I draw upon economic sociology to analyze the social dimensions and the relations of money, following theoretically the path of Viviana Zilica, Gustav Peebles, or Nina Vandelli. And I asked the research question, and I'll read them out slowly. First, how do social relationships facilitate or hinder economic interactions that are necessary for undocumented migration? Second, how do economic interactions in turn then shape social relationships throughout the migration trajectory? And third, how do the changing locations of the trajectory shape the social relationships and economic interactions between involved actors? In order to have a concept that appeared big enough or broad enough to really theorize these questions, I draw upon the Moral Economy by Thompson and Scott from the 1960s and 70s, as this allowed me to investigate meaning making and social relationships in economic interactions, which shape and are shaped by social norms between actors. Recently, we see an increase of or almost like a revival in the concept of the moral economy being used, applied to migration, in particular to undocumented and forced migration. What I really take from it as an essence is that economic interactions are guided by diverging sets of values, norms, and obligations in various locations along migration trajectories. And with this, I just want to give you a brief overview of the research that exists already on these economic interactions in undocumented migration research, which, however, is always very separated into different groups. So There exists, first of all, the entire field of literature on smuggling and seeing smuggling as an illicit business structure. There's a second set of research existing that looks at how undocumented migration is facilitated through families, mainly looking at money lending prior to departure, and then the enormous literature on remittances. To a smaller degree, also we have literature on camp economies, just to think mainly about the relationships between the camp and host communities, the entire research field around Alexander Betts, and with humanitarian actors, here the research field of Harold Bond. However, these are two very separate fields. And then we have the final one, and these are the relationships between fellow migrants, which nevertheless focuses still mainly on kinship relationships and much less so on non-relatives. What I think is very rare, though, are research projects or just ideas that connect these four spheres, but also include further actors who are all part of the economic interactions that facilitate the entire process of crossing borders. And this is where I really want to go, or what I saw throughout these 1.5 years of active field research for the project, but also over the course of the past 7 years by now. And here you see this graph that came out from, that I really saw throughout the research process. And it also, besides the already named actors, it also includes state agencies and humanitarian actors. So to first speak about the closest unit, and these are families. I divide them between close and distant families. And what I look at are really the processes of money lending and the communication necessary to do so. Most of the participants told me that they paid between 3,000 euro, but usually up to 17,000, 20,000 euro for the trajectory. However, these are people who in Iran worked for approximately 250 to 300 US dollar. So I wondered how it becomes possible to really gather or pool these large sums. And immediately people told me about these informal loan systems within families that have existed for a longer time already, but that are once again activated for the trajectory. And to give you an example, the protagonist maybe of the research that I talked about before, who wants to be called Samira in the research, she was a single woman in her late 20s when she left Iran on the way to Turkey, all the way to Germany. And she had to convey to her family that she was able to do the route, that she was trustworthy to be given the money, and that she would succeed in giving the money back. So really having to portray herself as a respected woman in the community so that family members would want to give her between 100 to 200, 300 US dollar that she could use to pay her smuggler. Through an informal loan without interest rates and without strictly navigated payback modalities. However, it was very clear that she would have to pay it back eventually. The second relationship is that with smugglers, or Rajagba, as they are called among my protagonists and participants. And here it really is fundamental to understand that Afghans have been forced to move away out of Afghanistan since the 1980s. So the entire role of the Rajagba, of the smuggler, is already almost like a social function. The selection is based on recommendations and a reputation that a smuggler has to create for himself, and that both smuggler and his clients are aware of. So there is almost a process of negotiation that becomes possible, and that I was allowed to participate in. Then comes the other set, so now a not immediate connection to the undocumented migrant, but that are state agencies and humanitarian actors. And for the state agents, the immediate economic interaction would have been bribery, which did exist on the Iranian or Turkish borders, but on the so-called Balkan route did not even take place anymore, because violence, especially from Croatian border police, was so immediate that there was no room for bribes anymore, as without persecution, these border controls would just steal iPhones, money, documents from migrants, as well as state agencies interacting in complete neglect of camps. On the other side, humanitarian actors who I argue coexist within these border spaces and alongside these state agents, and engage in a more economy of charity distributions, but also care and control. And very interestingly, my informants strongly divided between the money, between humanitarian actors working as volunteers, so doing this without receiving financial benefits on their own, versus those working for international organizations, and thereby also adapted their own judgment of the services in this moral economy. And then finally come the economic interactions and social relations that exist with a group that is very close. So those who are being smuggled together, who, as I argue, or what I saw throughout the field research among these Afghan groups who were smuggled together, engaged in shared householding, but also paid work and informal loans. And in the third part of this presentation lecture, I now want to talk more about this one particular example, because I think that is something that has been very little addressed in research until now. To just illustrate one of these 5 interactions, and I'm happy to speak about all the others later in the Q&A, who are all equally important in the book, but just to really illustrate this, I will now focus on this last part here. So the paid work and the money lending that exists among fellow migrants who are smuggled together. And this matters particularly in the later part of the migration trajectory. So not in Iran or Turkey, but mainly in Greece, in the camps, and then later on the Balkan route. And the reason for that is that funds dry up. So often the trajectory becomes more expensive than originally anticipated, and families are no longer able to send money. And due to the camp situation or the very deprived situation in the forest, it becomes very hard to work or get any other money necessary in order to continuously cross borders and pay smugglers for a safe passage. So here, this paid work and the money lending among those being smuggled together come in. And I will now give you some examples of this work. And the first one, for example, for paid work is this notebook that you see here in the picture. And this is the notebook of Sabir, who was categorized as unaccompanied minor in one of the Greek camps, and he could not receive any further financial support from the Greek side. Usually others would get 150 euro at that time in summer 2019, but because he was seen as an unaccompanied minor, he was only given food and charity items. He could not himself get the necessary funds to move, for example, or to take the bus to the capital of the island. He could not buy himself a SIM card. He could also not pay for a smuggler further. So what he did, he explained to me, was that he used the one resource that he had available, and that were the food items given to him, and he would sell it to the one group of clients he could find, the former migrants in the camp. And here you can see how he writes like moose, banana, or ab meyve, like with fruit juice, and he would collect them in the morning and then sell them throughout the day to those who were not willing to wait in the notorious lines in the camp for 4 or 5 hours. And by this, he slowly collected the money he needed in order to move out of the camp and pay for the bus to then go further. And this itself is such a strong example of the agency that he created, but also how he was able to navigate the need for money beyond what charity or the state was given him through the network around him. Further examples of how to generate money through paid work in the camp were, for example, baking bread, which is what Koza and Roshan did. And they would sell it at night, bake at night and sell it during the day. Or you can see here the sign that says supermarket, and it was a small supermarket in the camp. Other work existed as well, for example, that of an electrician within the camp working for 2 to 5 euro repairing, for example, cookers, only among those who were close to the own group, so only to other Afghans, but with asking for money for that. And then here you see this picture of a Western Union shop, and you're right, this picture is from Turkey, it's not from Greece, but what I say is nevertheless the same. And that is that in order to receive money via Western Union, for example, you do need a passport. So for people who do not have a passport, which was the case for almost all of the informants in the group that I was allowed to accompany, there's no possibility to actually then receive money beyond other systems such as Hawala. But some people did have passports, and they sold the service of receiving money for others in their name through their passport and charged between 5 and 10% for that, thereby making money off the others to then further continue the route. But here you can already see how it was important to know who has a passport, where a local Western Union shop was, and trusting that person enough to send all the money from family members or others to that account to then receive the money. In addition to this paid work, what mattered maybe even more are the informal loans. And based on the research and the many interviews in which this repeatedly came up, 3 different categories became visible. So first were small weekly loans that mattered especially at the end of the month when money was getting tight, the money that at that time the Greek government was still giving. And Mariam, for example, a woman in her early 30s on Lesbos, said to me how important these loans were. I'm saying that maybe in the opinion of a European person, 5 euro is little money, but possibly here for someone, 5 euro has the same value as for you, addressing me as a researcher, 10 euro. You only have 10 euro and you give 5 euro to your friend. These 5 euro, believe me, have maybe the value of what in Europe could be 500 euro, because in that very moment, it has such a benefit for the other person. What she's not saying is in that moment that, of course, she expects to receive the 5 euro again in the end. That is something that she didn't have to explicitly state because it was clear that these would be even out. In addition to this, also exist mid-range loans for very defined purchases where both lender and borrower had to agree that this was a useful investment. So Jana, for example, said, since January, I didn't have a phone. Well, I then borrowed 100 euro from Leila, her friend, so that I could buy a new phone. I went to buy the phone, and then the next month, when my money came, I went on the very first day of the month to give her the 100. So these 2 women themselves negotiated the process of money lending to buy this phone, and then Jana was able to give the money back to Leila, but thereby also tightening their friendship bond, but also their financial reliance on each other, as they later emphasized. The most important money lending that exists, nevertheless, and really matters for the entire connection between border crossings are the loans that are given for paying a smuggler. And I will just read out this quote by Dus to really emphasize the need that these informal loans had. A friend of ours did not have the money, Dus said. He tried to receive money from his family, but they couldn't gather it or send the money to him. Me, Rahmat, and another close friend, we said that we will give the money to you. We will bring you, let you walk with us. His money, so his friends, was entirely my help for him, my support and my money. And even my help with his smuggler helped him because he didn't have the money. So I gave it to him. What this shows is really the connection that money has for border crossings, but also how social relationships are necessary to activate or even enter these economic interactions. And in return, that those who do not have these social relationships, in most cases, were those who got stuck along the way, because the European asylum system works in a way that only those who reach EU territory can actually claim, meaning that those who are not able to move further, not just by physical strength, but also due to a lack of maybe useful social relationships and money, were kind of left out of the system. And by this, I now just want to conclude by emphasizing the contributions that I hope to make with the book. And that is first, conceptually, that looking at the entire trajectory also allows acknowledging those who otherwise become stuck along the way. It shows the mobility of a group with a prolonged, multidirectional, circular migration movements. But it also shows that borders are continuously being crossed. Only with each wall that is built, its crossing becomes deadlier and more costly. And theoretically, using the concept of the moral economy really shows how this is a flexible and overarching framework. And methodologically, I really want to engage more with multi-sided ethnographies, as I do believe that a lot of the parts that make up these trajectories only become visible when entering different parts of the routes over and over, as they are sometimes invisible, for example, in the beginning, but become visible later, or the other way around. And for this, I'm, as I said before, I'm deeply embedded to all the informants who brought me to places and picked me up in each of the countries and bringing me to their sites. So thank you very much for now. I'm very much looking forward to your questions, to Nada's comments, and to the discussion we'll have afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Hannah, that was predictably great. And I will basically keep silent. I just want to reiterate that this is very much a study on the agency. I think that's also what you write in your book, the agency of migrants, which is, more mainstream migration research is always invoked, but hardly taken seriously. So here we have a study we can look forward to about what migrants in all these difficult situations actually do. Also, of course, the limits of their agency again. But with that, I hand over to Nadia and look forward to your comments, Nadia, please.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks again for the invitation. It's really an absolute pleasure being here and get engaged in the discussion of such a very interesting work. I really want to pick up on the last point that actually you make, Volker. I want to start my my points with the fact that this is really, really amazing in the sense that basically, as you said, the subjectivity of migrants are always kind of sidelined in the research, although we talk a lot about it basically, but it's because it's hard basically to take it into account in the research. Most of the questions we are facing, the questions which are coming from the European countries, from the policy relevant kind of questions basically that impose on researchers. And it's really rare to take the subjectivity of migrants seriously and sort of look at the things from their perspectives. That's something that I see here, and it's very, very interesting for me. Particularly because it's about Afghan migrants. So Hannah talked about it. At least in Iran, we have like 40 years of being or living in a limbo, basically, without any perspective of naturalization or anything. And it's interesting to see how this background of informal living in Iran, as Hannah said, it's like more than 2 million people perhaps are undocumented in Iran. And also those who are documented, they don't have like a lot of rights as migrants, basically. So if you're an Afghan in Iran, of course, you need to rely on an official network, basically, in particular for your financial stuff. If you want to buy something, you cannot buy it for yourself. You need to find someone who would accept to buy something in his or her name, for you, a card, a house, a phone, a SIM card, and many other things. So this is interesting to see how then the scale of this experience, this become sort of like a, I don't want to call it a tradition, but like sort of develop capacity to organize things in a very, very hard situation to be helpful then in the course of migration trajectory. Another very important point for me was that basically a kind of good quality of knowledge, in terms of the contribution to knowledge production, because it's always a question for us, particularly here in Europe, when we're thinking of studying, for example, a topic in Iran, in Turkey, somewhere else, it's always, there is a question that can we actually produce a good knowledge approaching them from Europe. And to me, we have like this pool of helicopter research of researchers just jumping on a topic without knowing anything about it and without being interested in investing time in it, And then at the same time, on the other pool, we have this argument saying that, no, if you want to produce a good knowledge on Afghans, you should be Afghan yourself, or you should be Iranian yourself, you should be Turkish yourself. I think this research is a good example to show, so not just to take subjectivity of migrants seriously, but also for me is an example of taking subjectivity of us researchers seriously to show that if you want to do a good research, it's possible. It's not that it's not possible. Of course, there are always institutional factors that limit us. But apart from a kind of identity politics in knowledge production, this is a good example to show how research in a situation which is very complex, not accessible, basically can be done. Okay. Saying that, I want to ask a few questions, Hannah, perhaps just as an introduction, because I don't want to take your time so much. I want to hear you talking more in the discussion. One thing that I may ask also before, perhaps one occasion, I guess, was that for many of researchers here, well, we are now talking more about the connection or like how migration and integration are really one concept. It's not two separate concepts. Because we're working on in this project Transmit, always have this question that how these different experiences of migration, these particularities of being a migrant in transit in Turkey, in Greek, and other countries would influence later experience here in Germany as a migrant. So this I know is perhaps beyond the book, but this is something really, really would be also important in terms of showing how a study on integration here with the generalization of all migrants, cannot actually account for its particularities. And another question for me, I like to hear about like the few moments perhaps, or moments that you have like an ethical questions in doing this research, and how did you deal with them? So what kind of ethical question you face, if you kind enough to give us examples perhaps, if you like. And then the third one, sorry, I'm just listing just the third one would be, I'm interested to know how migrants, so in particular, so those who interviewed them, how they compare different borders together. So how these narratives of borders shape in comparison to other borders. Was it helpful, for example, for people to remind the horrible border of Iran-Turkey, you know, in other occasion, or this would disappear as a reference for reference point, basically, for comparison? So how previous border crossing, you know, appear or, you know, influence the experience of, you know, a certain border crossing, let's say in Balkan. And yeah, also a side question perhaps, that because this whole network is based on a kind of unofficial social capital. I wonder how this social capital, you know, basically that's okay, I'm the one who I'm repaying my debts. How this social capital travel, you know, around the borders? So maybe you're not with the same group that you started, and how would you then, yeah, you know. Thanks again for the presentation, and I'm really looking forward to hear about discussions and the discussion from you.
Thank you, Nadia.